Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Cristina Lumbreras from EENA speaking. I think we are already, most of the registered people are already here. So I think we can start if that's okay for you. Okay, so welcome everybody. Welcome to this webinar on accessibility to emergency services. We will have three presentations, and we will give the floor for questions at the end of the three presentations. You can use the chat if you want to ask questions or make some comments, and we will read them at the end, and the speakers we will answer as best as possible. So I think it's now time for presentation. So Benoit, you can take the floor.
Thank you, Cristina. Before jumping to my presentation, just like to welcome Mer Hakobian, who works at the European Disability Forum. Hi, Mer. Thank you for joining us today and taking the time to come and share your experience with us. So we will divide this webinar in 4 times. First, I will give a presentation about the new and the upcoming legislation about accessibility for people with disabilities with regards to emergency communications. Then my colleague Cristina will review, let's say, the current where we are in Europe, the current state of the art, and the different technologies that are deployed in Europe. And then Mer will give us his point of view from the European Disability Forum, because we believe that it's very useful to share this opinion and this feedback with you. I see here in the list of participants that you are mostly people working in public authorities in charge of emergency communication in your country. So it's good to hear also what to hear the needs from the communities of representing people with disabilities. So thank you, Mer, for joining us. And after the welcome. And after the three presentations, we will have a time for questions and discussions. For that, I invite you to use the chat function that is provided with this webinar tool. So if you followed the previous webinars, we told you to use the questions, but for now, let's more use the chat so that everybody can see and read the question at the same time. And I also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and that the recording and the presentations will be sent to everybody afterwards. So in case you miss something, you can still access to it, or you can also share the information more easily with your colleagues. So I'm going to start now with an update on the legislation. Just time to make myself a presenter. Yes, so now you should be able to see my screen, and you get a bit spoiled because you see the last slide up. Can you see my screen? Can somebody confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you, Mer, and thank you, Marta and Cristina. So for those who don't know me, I'm Benoit Vivier. So I'm the Public Affairs Manager at EENA. So my job consists mostly in following legal and political issues around emergency communication. So I have followed deeply and attentively the recent legislative discussions here in Brussels in the past year. So mostly the European Electronic Communications Code, which I'm sure you're familiar with, as well as the European Accessibility Act that I will present in a few minutes. So, and my role is also to help the public authorities implementing the legislations that have been voted in the past years. So I just want to start before really providing an update on what has been happening in Brussels before. I mean, in the past years, want to start by recalling that accessibility for people with disabilities is a fundamental right. It is a basic human right that needs to be guaranteed, and any reference to the fundamental rights do refer to the need to promote access to a wide range of services for people with disabilities. So here is an article from the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, which states that the European Union recognizes and respects the rights of persons with disabilities to benefit from measures designed to ensure their independent social and occupational integration and participation in the life of community. And so there's many texts. It's also recognized by the European Charter of Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, sorry. And what serves as the main reference in, let's say, in internet, it's not really international law, in global law related to regarding disabilities, is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And so this is binding on all the states who signed and ratified this convention, and that's the case for all the member states of the European Union. And in this convention, there is actually a specific reference to access to emergency services. So it's in the Article 9, where there's a mention to access to information, communication, and other services, including electronic services and emergency services. When I move to the European legislation, which is what brings us today, maybe most of you are familiar with the Universal Service Directive, which is the legislation that serves now as the main legislation on emergency calls in the European Union. So most of you are very familiar with this directive. So as a reminder, a directive is, I'm just going to charge my computer. A directive is a binding legislation of the European Union. So it needs to be applied. Failing that, the European Commission can impose sanctions on the member states who do not comply with this directive. However, the way it is written is voluntarily, let's say, vague, so as to leave some flexibility to the member states to what we call to transpose. So it means to translate the element of this directive in the national legislation. So there's always some specific deadline by which the member states need to have implemented the provisions of this directive. So typically the deadline is 2 years. So the Universal Service Directive was first adopted in 2002. There was no direct reference to people with disabilities. However, the first paragraph of this article, of the article on emergency calls, was saying that member states shall ensure that all end users are able to call the emergency services free of charge by using the single European emergency call number 112. So here we mean all end users. So of course that includes people with disabilities. However, the issue is also the word call. So for deaf and hard of hearing people, it's a bit harder to make a call actually. So there was some kind of, it was a bit vague when you look at the exact vocabulary and definition of terms. So this was adopted in 2002, but as you know, it was amended in 2009, and this brought a specific paragraph about people with disabilities, which I'm going to show you now. And this paragraph basically says that member states shall ensure that access for disabled end users to emergency services is equivalent to that enjoyed by other end users. So we talk here about the principle of equivalent access to the emergency services, and this equivalent access needs to be guaranteed by the member states. And a recital, so a recital is some, let's say, non-binding element of a legislation that just serves to give more context or more clues on how to interpret the articles. It's in all the legislation. So the recital in this legislation says that member states should take specific measures to ensure that emergency services, including 112, are equally accessible to disabled end users, in particular deaf, hearing impaired, speech impaired, and deaf blind users, and this could involve the provision of specific terminal devices for hearing impaired users, text relay services, and other specific equipment. So there were a few technologies that were listed, but it was a bit still a bit vague. What do we mean by equivalent access? Especially the rest of the paragraph on 112 talks still about still referred to emergency calls. So as we saw, it's a bit tricky to talk about call. So how can these member states ensure this equivalent access? That was a bit vague, and that led to very diverging implementation between all the member states of the European Union. Christina will present it to us in a few minutes. So those were a bit the issues with the Universal Service Directive, which in the end was not very well implemented. At least these provisions, they were not very well implemented by the member states, and there was still a lot of question marks remaining. So if you follow the activities of EENA, you know that the Universal Service Directive will come into an end at the end of this year, in December 2020. It will be replaced by the the European Electronic Communications Code, which is also a directive. So there's still 2 years to transpose the provisions of this directive. So it was adopted in December 2018. So plus 2 years, it makes the deadline in December 2020. And at that time, it will become the main legislation on emergency communications. Because, yeah, the big change in this directive is actually a change in the vocabulary. As I told you before, we were talking about emergency calls. And now we are talking basically about emergency communications. So that, besides just a change in one word, there's a lot of things that do change, because of course, from a call to a communication is much wider actually in the means by which we can contact the emergency services. So you see that when we talk about the specific paragraph about accessibility to 112 for people with disabilities, we see that here the emergency communication concept is really developed. We see member states shall ensure that access for end users with disabilities to emergency services is available through emergency communications and is equivalent to that enjoyed by other end users. And so how do we define emergency communications? Well, this is defined in a specific recital of the legislation. So you can find the recital here. Emergency communications are means of communication that include not only voice communications, but also SMS, messaging, video, or other types of communications, for instance, real-time text, total conversation, and relay services. So this, unfortunately, is not extremely clear in the what is mandatory, because as you see, it's or, so it kind of leaves some flexibility also to the member states, but this change is very much welcome, because now the scope is at least much clearer as well, and yeah, it's much wider than just emergency calls. So we have here already a good description of what can be understood as a mean of emergency communications. So yeah, for the member states, it will be important to guarantee that people with disabilities can access through at least one or some, most likely, some of these means that are listed here, in order to ensure a universal access to emergency services. When we talk about location information, you know that there is a specific paragraph in the EECC about location information, which mandates mostly AML, so that's why some of you know it. But I just want to mention that here again, we talk about locating the emergency communications. It's no longer locating emergency calls. So when we talk about emergency communications, that means that if I go back to the slide before, when, for instance, an SMS is implemented or other technologies, then the location should also be provided. So when a deaf person, for instance, sends an SMS to 112, this SMS should come with location information. And when we talk about, so you probably know the sentence, this shall include network-based location information and where available handset-derived caller location information. though we talk here about caller location information, it's still about emergency communications. So where possible, so where it is possible to use the handset-derived location information to locate an SMS. So it's the case already on the Android on the Android phones. When somebody sends an SMS to 112, there's a possibility to use AML to retrieve the location of this person. Then it is mandatory. Where it is possible, it's mandatory. So that's very important to take that into account when you implement the European Electronic Communications Code, is that the provisions on location do also apply to people with disabilities. And then there are also specific provisions for people traveling to other member states, of course, if I may say, but this was also not very clear in the previous legislation. So I put it here in bold that so the Commission and the national regulatory authorities shall take appropriate measures to ensure that end users with disabilities, when they travel in other member states, they can access emergency services, of course, on an equivalent basis with other end users, and where feasible without any pre-registration. So the where feasible here is not very precise, but it should be taken into account that this is a requirement, let's say, set out in the legislation where feasible without any pre-registration, because of course, when people when let's say mostly deaf or hard of hearing people cross border within the European Union, if they are not registered in the country where they physically are, and if they have an emergency, they should not be asked to pre-register, because otherwise they will very hardly have access to the emergency services. So that can be very dangerous situations for these people. And then this is completed by those measures shall seek to ensure interoperability across member states and shall be based to the greatest extent possible on European standards or specifications. So that means that we already have some means to ensure interoperability between the member states. For instance, if you use an app, there's a possibility to have interoperability with PMEA. My colleague Christina will talk about it in a few minutes. So yeah, just take into account this as well. When we talk about ensuring access to emergency services, it's not only for the citizens of one country, but it's also for people traveling and for the visitors, and they should also be able to contact easily the emergency services. Yeah, and then I just wanted to mention as well that so we saw the main provisions that are in the European Electronic Communications Code, but these provisions will be completed again by a delegated act, which will be adopted probably in 2022 by the European Commission. So delegated act is a specific procedure to basically have a new legislation that completes another legislation. So it's a lighter procedure, it goes much quicker to adopt it, but it just sets out usually more concrete things on how to guarantee or how to reach the objectives that are set out in a directive. And you can see in so I quoted the legislation here below. You can see that this delegated act will address routing to the most appropriate PSAP, access for end users with disabilities to the emergency services, and caller location information solutions. So this is not completely it with the European Electronic Communications Code, because a new set of measures, more concrete measures, will be adopted within the next 2 years. Then, so this was about the European Electronic Communications Code. At the same time, another legislation was voted. So it's the directive on the accessibility requirement for products and services, which we also call the European Accessibility Act. So as for the previous legislations that I explained, it's a directive. So it sets out some objectives that the member states need to reach, and they are, let's say, free on how to reach those objectives. So it will take some time. It will be more than 2 years actually. It will take some time to to implement the provisions in the directive. So it was adopted at the beginning of last year in 2019. So member states are also in the process of implementing now the provisions that are in this European Accessibility Act. So what does it say about emergency services? First of all, what I understand here is that so since all the member states have voice communications, at least real-time text should be implemented to guarantee, let's say, a correct access or an equivalent access for people with disabilities to the emergency services. You can see here the article. I will not read everything, but basically this article intends to further precise a bit what we mean by equivalent access. So when we have voice communication, when voice communication is guaranteed to everybody, then people with disabilities should at least have real-time text. And for instance, also where video is provided, then total conversation services should also be implemented. So it's some kind of precision on what we mean by equivalent access. So for this, there's a specific calendar. So the legislation clearly sets out that by the 28th of June 2022, the member states should have adopted laws to reach these objectives, and the provisions in these national laws should be applied by the 28th of June 2025. So it's still a long deadline, but of course it is highly recommended to have it done as early as possible, because well, let's not wait until 2025. 2025 is still in a lot of time, and this is quite basic requirement, of course. So let's not wait until that long. And then another provision that is in the European Accessibility Act is that so when you're contacted, when PSAPs are contacted by some communication, let's say by real-time text, then the same mean of communication should be used in the response, of course, if I may say. But for instance, if you receive a video call, let's say you cannot respond with an SMS, for instance. So the PSAP should use the same communications means as received, of course. And this is to be applied by the 28th of June 2027. So yeah, I think that is it for both the European Electronic Communications Code and the European Accessibility Act. So just to sum up where we are with the legislation. So now we have only the Universal Service Directive. At the end of the year, this will be replaced by the European Electronic Communications Code. And then this is being completed also by the European Accessibility Act, which will, well, is already enforced, but will start to be applied in a few years. And then this will also be completed by the delegated act completing the EECC. So this is where we are today, and there's still some milestones in the future. So that is it for my presentation. If you have some questions, you can use the chat part of this webinar tool. In the meanwhile, so you have all the time you want to ask the questions. You can also contact me by email. And now I will first give the floor to my colleague Cristina Lumbreras, who will present to us the different technologies that are being used in Europe. So Cristina will set you as a presenter now.
Yes. Sorry, I think I also spoiled my part of the presentation. Hello, thank you, Benoit. I'm Cristina Lumbreras. I work for EENA. I'm the technical director, and I will present you what is the current situation now in Europe. So we have here several available channels that are now used for giving accessibility to emergency services in Europe. We have the first and very basic one, that is the fax. So in some countries, it is possible to contact emergency services via fax. So it's a little bit old-fashioned, but still working in some countries. We have also the SMS, that it's one of the most used channels for contacting emergency services for people with disabilities. We have also the dedicated apps. So these are apps that some countries and regions have developed. So they are usually specific apps for giving access to emergency services. Well, as I said, they are only for a specific country or even only for a specific region. In some countries, real-time text is available. So the difference between real-time text and chat is that in real-time text, the text is transmitted instantly as it is typed or created, so letter by letter. We have also, in some countries, the possibility to contact emergency services through relay services, where an interpreter helps in the communication between the citizens and the emergency services. And in a few countries, and coming and hopefully being implemented in more, it's what is called total conversation, so that the citizen can contact directly emergency services through video, voice, and real-time text at the same time. And so, of course, the best would be that the same channels that people are using in their daily life are also available for contacting emergency services too. So that in the horrible situation where somebody needs to contact emergency services, this person doesn't have to think, oh, I have to use this specific app for contacting emergency services, but that they can use something that is that they are using in their daily life. So the current situation in Europe, as a summary, is that it's not harmonized. So each country has its own local solution. It can even be in a specific region of a country. There is no harmonization of channels. In some countries we have fax, in other SMS, in other apps, in other real-time text, in other total conversation. In some of them we have several channels. There is no harmonized emergency number for emergency services for people with disabilities in Europe. So in some countries 112 is available, but not in others. In other countries, you may have a short specific number different from 112, or even a long number. And when you have regional solutions, this long number changes from region to region in the same country. Also, I think Benoit has already spoken about the pre-registration. Pre-registration is needed in some countries and not in others. So this means that the people needs to contact previously emergency services to say, hello, my name is Mr. Smith, and this is my phone number. So, and I'm a person with disability. So, and this is needed to be done, of course, previously. So in case the person hasn't pre-registered and this person is in an emergency situation, she or he will not be able to contact emergency services using the most appropriate channel. Interactivity is available in most countries, but not in all of them. This means interactivity is when the person can send a message, the PSAP can answer this message, and there is a conversation. And in some countries, there's only one-shot emergency message that can be sent to the citizen, to the emergency services, but there's no possibility to make a conversation with the caller. Automatic precise caller location is not always available. So in some countries, you have the AML associated to some channels that are used for contacting emergency services, or usually if an specific app is available, this app also provides the handset-based caller location, but it's not always like this. And of course, if in most channels, using most channels, and because of this unharmonization of the access to emergency services for people with disabilities, if the person travels abroad, and it can be also in a different region from in specific countries, he or she will need to search what is the channel to be used in the visited country, as most probably it will not be the same way from his or her home country. This is very different from other citizens that can use 112 with their phone everywhere in the same way. So I will in the following slides we will see 3 maps. I will show one first map with the available channels for contacting emergency service in the European Union. In a second map, you will see what are the emergency numbers available for contacting emergency services, specifically for people with disabilities. And as a third point, and with a third map, I want to highlight the difference between countries where you need pre-registration and others where it's not needed. So all this information comes from EENA PSAP's organization document that we published at EENA every year, and also together with information coming from the COCOM report on the implementation of the single European emergency number. And data are from 2019, so in situation may have changed in some countries during 2020. So the first map is on the available channels. You see that you have several types of channels. The SMS in red, you see that a lot of countries have red inside. There are also apps on blue that it's also well used in the European Union. Video and real-time test is starting to be used, and I hope it will be more and more. In some countries, you have fax. In the ones that I put in green, it's it's one of the most used channels. So it's old-fashioned, I have to say. And also in black, the relay services. So you see that in some countries you have more than one color. In some countries you have more than 2 channels, but I have put only the 2 channels that are mostly used. And just to emphasize of the unharmonization of these of the channels in some countries, as for example Spain, you have very different. You can have different channels in the different regions. Let's go with the second map. So here you can see the emergency numbers. So here there are only 2 colors, so much easier. You have on blue the ones where you can use directly 112, and in yellow the ones that have a dedicated number. The dedicated number can be a short number, so equivalent to 112. For example, in France, they have 114, and in others, they have a long number. In some countries, you can have a different number, short or long, for each region. And not all dedicated numbers are free of charge for the users. That it's also a difference between users that can call 112 with their phone, that it's always free, and users that have to use the long numbers or specific short numbers that in some countries is not free of charge. And here is the third point I wanted to highlight from the pre-registration point of view. In yellow, you have the one where it's not needed to pre-register, and in blue, the ones that are pre-registration is needed. And you have in some countries both colors. It's because you can have different channels, and for one channel it is mandatory to register and not for the other. For example, there are countries where they have an app and SMS, and you need to pre-register if you want to use the app, but you can use without pre-registration the SMS. And also, again, in some countries, the registration is done regionally. So not only people traveling abroad have to think about pre-registering in the visited country, but also when they just go to the neighbor region in the same country. And I have to add that it's not always easy to find how to pre-register in the different regions or in the different countries. So we have Benoit already mentioned some standards and initiatives for harmonization, or at least to make interoperability possible, and that people can use the same technology that they are using for contacting emergency services in their home country, abroad, or in another region. So the first one I want to mention is the PMI architecture. That it's an architecture that has been standardized, and it makes the interconnection of apps from different countries and regions possible. So this way, a person who has downloaded an app in his or her country and travels to another country, he or her will be able to use this app for contacting emergency services abroad. I have put a link in case you are interested in having more information, as we don't have enough time to go into the details. And as I also want to highlight the work that we are doing on Next Generation 112. This is a complete evolution of the current telecommunications technology used today for contacting emergency services. And it opens emergency services to data. It enables the video, text, and voice communications. So this would make total conversation possible. And I have also added a link if people are interested in knowing more about the Next Generation 112. Otherwise, I would be here speaking for 1 more hour. So, and I don't want to be too long. And also a very important point is not always citizens needs to contact emergency services, but also public authorities in case of big emergencies or dangerous situations. They want and they contact citizens that are located in a certain area. It's what we call alerting the population, or reverse 112. And member states will have the obligation to implement reverse 112. They will be able to send alerts to all the population if they want, or people located in a concrete area. I have also added a link if you want to have more information. And these systems needs also to be accessible, of course, because all the citizens have the right to receive these alerts and be able to understand them. So the solutions that are currently being implemented for public warning are text-based, and this is an open question. Is this sufficient? Should we go further for to make these alerts accessible for all? And as a last point, we have a document on 112 accessibility for people with disabilities that we published already in 2012. So we need to update it, and we have done already some work on it. But of course, it will be very helpful to have your views and comments. So contact us if you want to participate in this work. And this was my last slide. So you will be able to ask questions at the end of the three presentations. I will make a presenter now.
So before my presentation is being put on the screen, I will just turn on my webcam to say hello again. Hello, I'm Maher from the European Disability Forum. Thank you very much for the invitation today. I actually learned quite a lot from colleagues' presentations myself, and I hope my presentation will also be useful for you. It's mainly going to be a sort of a wrap up from a disability perspective, because a lot of things have been already mentioned, but I will try to give some different angle to the topic from the point of view of users. So I will just turn off my camera now. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm from the European Disability Forum, and today's presentation from my side will be on our recommendations for accessible emergency communications and public warnings. If I may have the next slide, please. And the content of my presentation today I will first present where I work, the European Disability Forum, and who we are, and then our general work and EU and international law on accessible electronic communications and emergency information and communication for persons with disabilities. And finally, I will present you some recommendations that we have for accessible emergency communications and public warnings, which we also included in a very comprehensive document, which will be linked at the end of this presentation. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have for me at the end of my presentation. So moving forward, I will just quickly close my inbox, otherwise it's making noises. Okay, sorry. So who we are, I work at the European Disability Forum, which is an umbrella organization of persons with disabilities. There are almost around 100 million persons with disabilities in the EU. This means that it's about 1/5 of EU's population. So 1 in 5 persons in the EU has a disability. I want to highlight this because I think what we see from in our work is sometimes accessibility can be seen as an add-on measure to services or products or any area of life, but this is we promote mainstreaming accessibility because it affects also millions of people in the EU. And we, as I said, we are Brussels based. We have about 100 organizations that are our members. Those are city national disability council. So in each of your countries, you will have a national disability council, but also we have umbrella organizations which are based in Brussels that work on different disability focus. For example, European Union of Deaf, which is also very much focusing on accessibility of emergency services in their work. They have worked with EENA, I know, and other also disability organizations. And we all promote the rights of persons with disabilities on EU level. And the main kind of purpose is to ensure that the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is implemented in the EU and in member states. And our motto is nothing about us without us, which means that in all the policies and measures and legislative measures that are developed at EU and member state level, persons with disabilities have to be included meaningfully in those discussions and developments, because at the end of the day, many of those new policies also affect us. So we have to have a place at the table, and therefore I just want to say again that I appreciate that we were invited today to speak at this webinar. Okay, so we can move forward. Benoit already presented me. I work as an accessibility officer at EDF. I work on different aspects such as like a built environment, transport, on passengers' rights, on information and communication technologies. So all of these areas from the point of view of accessibility. If you have further questions afterwards, feel free to email me. You can see the email in the slide. I just wanted to also mention this, and then coming to the topic of today. Yeah, so the first part is on accessible electronic communications and emergency information and communication for persons with disabilities. Here again, Benoit mentioned about the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This is an UN convention. The first human rights convention actually that EU has ratified also as an intergovernmental body. So the EU and all member states by now have ratified and are obliged legally to ensure that the convention is implemented in their countries. One of the principles of the convention is accessibility, because accessibility is a prerequisite for ensuring persons with disabilities rights in many aspects of life. And this prerequisite is enforced by Article 9 on accessibility, which was already mentioned. So I will not go too deeply in this. But the other article that is mentioned in the convention is Article 11, which is on situation of risk and humanitarian emergencies, and it says that state parties shall take all necessary measures to ensure the protection and safety of persons with disabilities in situations of risk, including situations of armed conflict, humanitarian emergencies, and the occurrence of natural disasters. So this is when emergency communications also comes into play and is important. If we go to the next slide. Here, I will mention that to implement the UN Convention, the accessibility of emergency information and communication aspects, EU has been developing certain legal frameworks. One that is relevant for us is maybe not so much for you, is the European Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which includes an aspect on emergency information provision. The other one is the Electronic Communication Code and also the Accessibility Act. All these directives, EU laws, they do not create new requirements because the convention, which all the member states have ratified, it already goes even beyond what is in these EU directives. So these EU laws do not create new requirements for member states. They just help it to further implement the convention. So the first one that I mentioned is the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, or the AVMSD in short, particularly Article 7.5. It mentions that countries have to ensure that emergency information, including public communications and announcements in natural disaster situations, which is made available to the public through audiovisual media services, is provided in a manner that is accessible to persons with disabilities. This means when there is an emergency broadcast, it needs to have live captions, which is example, subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing. It needs to have sign language interpretation. Audio description and spoken subtitles in this case is probably not so relevant, but the first two are highly crucial, so everybody has access to emergency information provided by public bodies. We saw during the COVID pandemic measures that there were major gaps in member states in providing accessible information to their citizens who are deaf and hard of hearing in particular. From this point of view, the next slide is focusing on the communications code. It's of course a very big piece of legislation. It focuses on a lot of aspects of electronic communications and services, but for us, it's the particular interest is the consumers, is end users' rights parts, which are, I mentioned the articles here, so if you want to check the document, you can find it easily. Those are covered under universal services, equal access and choice for persons with disabilities, Article 111, where the relationship with the Accessibility Act is very important because the Accessibility Act will ensure that the code is properly implemented in practice. And of course, for today's especially topic, the emergency communication and public warnings articles, which are 109 and 110, again, with the relevance of the Accessibility Act, are very important. Moving forward. Yeah, so the Accessibility Act comes into play in relation to the Audiovisual Media Services Directive and the Electronic Communications Code by providing kind of the surrounding framework that makes accessing those the services under those directives. For example, with the audiovisual media services, in order to be able to watch a film on Netflix, for example, the website has to be accessible, your tablet must be accessible, or your computer, the software must be accessible as well as the hardware. So these are aspects that are covered by the Accessibility Act, while the content accessibility, such as provision of subtitles, etc., these are by the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. In relation to the Communications Code, Accessibility Act is related in a way that it says that real-time text, for example, and total conversation services must be provided in electronic communications, or the terminal equipment such as a smartphone or a computer must be accessible, so a person can use that in order to access electronic communication services. Again, mentioned about the emergency of answering of emergency communications by public safety answering points. This is also covered by the Accessibility Act, while the code just generally gives a general obligation that this communication must be accessible. So the final part is our recommendations, which are also included in a toolkit that we created, and I shared the link at the end of this presentation. In particular, the code already has in the text, as it is now, that countries must ensure that everyone, including persons with disabilities, can access emergency services. Sorry, just 1 second. Yeah. Emergency services free of charge by the single European emergency number 112 and any additional national emergency number determined by the country. This must be possible even if you are using a public pay telephone. Countries must ensure that all emergency communications through 112 is possible, at least with the same level of speed and efficiency as through their national emergency number. Again, as mentioned, when a person with disability travels between different EU countries, equivalent access must be ensured, if possible, without pre-registration. This is what the code says, and this is a task that has to be realized by countries through their national regulatory or other competent authorities, but also the European Commission has a responsibility to ensure this. Countries also have to ensure that public warnings on emergency and disasters are sent by providers of mobile communication services to the concerned persons. This is covered by Article 110. And in addition, countries may decide to transmit public warnings through other communication services, for example, mobile app that relies on an internet access service. Moving to the next slide is what we want to see. So when the code is transposed into national law by the end of this year, we want to have national rules which specify that PSAPs or public safety answering points comply with the accessibility requirements for PSAPs laid down in the Accessibility Act. And as we know that now the Act is still not applied in countries, it still needs to go through a similar transposition process as the code. And the obligation for PSAPs, again, as mentioned, does not come into action until June 2027, which is a really long time. But the text of the Act is already published, the requirements are stated, so countries can already take notice and start applying them as soon as possible, because they can implement the rules sooner if they wish, and not wait until 2027. And this is something which we really encourage member states to do, because we are here speaking about emergency services and safety and people's lives. So the sooner this is ensured, the better. Another aspect is that no pre-notification should be required to access emergency communications, something that was again mentioned by colleagues from EENA. So safety first, of course. This is an absolute absurdity for us that administrative barriers come into play to make a barrier for persons accessing emergency communications. Something that missed out from the slide, sorry, but it's in the notes of the slide, is that electronic communication services across the EU must comply with the same accessibility and interoperability requirements when it comes to emergency communications. And here there is already a standard, a European standard, which on accessibility of information and communication, ICT services and products. It's EN 301549. There is already the version 311, which is the latest version. And soon the Accessibility Act also will have its own standards. But before that, the standards of the European standard on accessible ICT products and services can help member states ensure that emergency services are accessible and interoperability is ensured across the EU. We can go to the next slide about the emergency communications and public warnings. What we want again at national level is that 112 should be possible to contact via a relay service at all times, because we know that in different countries there are different rules, and sometimes the relay service is offered on let's say working hours or only during the week. But of course you can never plan your emergency, so this should be provided 24/7, and there should not be any caveats in this regard. We want to have public warning systems and emergency information that are accessible by more than one sensory channel, for example, through text and through audio, and that they are easy to understand with clear behavioral instructions. I think we often emphasize the accessibility for deaf and hard of hearing persons, but in terms of understandability, we should also take into account persons with intellectual disabilities, for example, and other persons for whom very clear and simple, easy to understand language is very crucial. And this can also help, for example, somebody that is not a native speaker, so it can be a broader use. And then we want that all of these obligations that we mentioned are extended to national emergency numbers, and to also the numbers 116000 and 116111. These are missing children and the child helplines, because also there should be the insurance that, for example, children with disabilities can contact the helpline, and also other hotlines such as the hotlines created for reacting or providing information for for the coronavirus pandemic, which were created and often not accessible to persons with disabilities. And the last slide, I think, in terms of content is will mention the advanced mobile location, which was already mentioned, so I will not go into detail with this. And the next generation 112, which again colleagues mentioned, we want these also to be developed and implemented in more and more states to ensure that effective emergency communication, accessible emergency communication is ensured for persons with disabilities. And with this, I finish my presentation, but the next slides, you can see some resources from EDF. We published a toolkit for transposition that basically toolkits are documents which are guidance and advice to our members in member states how to advocate towards their national governments to ensure better and more effective transposition of the EU level directives. So we did a toolkit on the communications code. We also had a webinar. The links are there. You can go and watch the webinar if you want. It's a bit broader than only on the 112 aspect. There's also a more concise document linked again. And the same we did for the Accessibility Act and the European Audiovisual Media Services Directive. So all these are available on our website. The last slide, I think. Yeah, and then it's linked to the directives, and on the bottom you can see also the link to the harmonized European standard on accessibility of ICT products and services, which can be useful. And I think with that, I finish my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have for me.
Thank you, Mer. Thanks a lot for making the time to give us your point of view about it. I guess I'm sure that was very useful for all the attendants. So there is a possibility for you to ask questions. We're a bit late in time, but I think we can allow us some more minutes to respond to the questions. So feel free to ask if you have some. In case you need to leave anyway, the recording of this webinar will be sent afterwards. So don't worry, you can also listen to it afterwards. So leaving the time to other people to ask questions, I will first take some that have already been asked. So the first one were about the legislation, actually, was from Denmark. And it was actually apparently unclear the different deadlines for the European legislation, and I can understand that because it's quite tricky. There's many different deadlines. So for the EECC, the deadline, so is the European Electronic Communications Code. For that, the deadline is December 2020. And the deadline means that the provisions need to be transposed, and that they should those requirements should be applied also at that time. So both transposition and application of the measures should be done by December this year. When we talk about the European Accessibility Act, so there are different deadlines. The deadline for the use of real-time text in addition to voice communication. And so maybe I can share my screen again, because that will make things easier. If I can. Yes, I will show my screen again so that you can see it better. So for the European Accessibility Act, these provisions that are about so real-time text and total conversation services that should be provided. So the transposition, so it should be in the national law by June 2022. But these provisions that are in the national law should be applied by June 2025. So it is possible to have the law passed, let's say, in January 2022, and that the national law enters into force a bit later. It's not advisable because, as we all said, the earlier the better. But so these are the deadlines. So transposition 2022, application 2025. And the other provision, which was about PSAPs using the same communication means, then this is both the transposition and the application of it in June 2027. So I hope that helped to clarify the doubts that there were on the deadline. There were a few more questions. So yeah, one question was, so does the legislation where it is mentioned providing real-time text explicitly demand real-time text technology, or more or less some kind of chat capability? My understanding is that since real-time text is explicitly mentioned, then this technology as such is required, but I'm not completely sure about the answer to that question, to be honest. Then we had the question from Victor Salgado Gonzalez, which I am going to read. So thanks for this session. Thanks for this session for EENA members. Are you considering to implement in the near future easy to understand alerts for reverse 112 and 112 apps interfaces, even with pictogram, for example, for interacting between 112 and people with intellectual disabilities, cognitive deterioration, so elderly people, and even kids, 4 to 7-year-old. So I guess, yeah, this was actually a question for the participants, more to understand. So if somebody wishes to contribute, you can write it in the chat or raise your hand. I think it's a very valid point, because it's indeed, so we talk a lot about public warning systems, and of course we need to ensure that these alerts must be received by everybody and understood by everybody. So this should, of course, be kept in mind. So in case you have anything to add to that, if you can please write it in the chat so that we will have the answer. Then we had a question from Victor Once, which is there a comparison study between accessibility features across pan-European 112 apps or web apps? So best practices, standard for PSAPs developers, etc. So I'm not aware of such study, but maybe either Christina or yourself, Mer, have know about these kind of studies.
No, I don't recall, but I know that BEREC does this type of studies, like comparing different situations in member states. So maybe the body of the European regulators, maybe they have. I can also check on the website, or if you go to their website, maybe you can find something. But I'm not aware of a particular study.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, let's have a look at on the website of BEREC. And then there was a question from Pierre Stevens, how the directives take into account the emergency professionals with disabilities. So I'm not aware of any directive specifically taking account of that, but Mer, you'll be probably much more knowledgeable than I am.
I don't think that they have. I think that's the thing, like with European legislation, they always see it from point of view of the user. I see also like in transport accessibility legislation, for example, it's always about accessibility towards the passenger and not about the people who work in the sector. But there is an EU directive on employment, which actually also obliges member states to ensure that persons with disabilities have equal access to employment. So anybody who would be working in emergency service with a disability would have to be ensured this that they can work. So even though there is, I don't think there is a accessibility angle in the, for example, in the code or in the Accessibility Act. With the anti-discrimination legislation, it would have to apply, and then people can actually, if they want, take their country to the court for not ensuring this this equality, but not from an accessibility point of view, but from an anti-discrimination point of view. I don't know if this
Yeah, it makes sense. And to complement that, the European competence on actually emergency professionals is very limited. So in that case, it's more the competence of member states. Though of course there is some, as you rightly said, there are some directives, small directives about labor law in general, but this is more in principle competence of the member states. So that is also why there are less European directives about really the work of emergency professionals with disabilities. Okay, I don't see any more question, neither in the chat, and nobody has raised their hand. So this will be your last possibility to make any comment or ask any question. Otherwise, we can close this webinar. Thank you everybody for your participation. In case you have any question, we remain available. You have seen our contact details in our presentation, so feel free to email us. As a reminder, the recording of this call as well as the presentations will be sent to you by email. So and I will also just want to add that so I have received by email several questions or requests about how other countries have transposed these very provisions about accessibility to 112. I don't always have the answer because I have very limited information related to that. So in case you do something in your country or pass laws or adopt different technologies, please, if you can let EENA know so that we will be aware of it, and we will also more easily share that with your peers in other countries, and what you are doing in your country can also help your peers in other ones. So if you can please share the information that you have, it would be great. So there is no more question, no comment. So thank you everybody for your participation. Special thanks to my colleague Christina and to Mayor Hakobian for your participation in this webinar. And yeah, we'll stay in touch and have a great rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.